On the night of March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport carrying 239 people toward Beijing. It was a routine flight, the kind that happens hundreds of times a day across the world. Passengers settled into their seats, flight attendants moved through the aisles, and the cockpit crew exchanged standard communications with air traffic control. Nobody on board, and nobody on the ground, had any reason to believe that within a few hours, this aircraft would become the greatest aviation mystery in human history. But that is exactly what happened. At 1:21 in the morning, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 simply vanished. Not gradually, not with a distress call, not with any warning at all, just gone. The transponder went silent. The plane dropped off civilian radar as if it had been erased. What made it even stranger was what military radar captured shortly after. The aircraft had not crashed. It had turned. Deliberately, sharply, and without any communicated reason, MH370 reversed its course, crossed back over the Malay Peninsula, and then banked southward toward one of the most remote and unforgiving stretches of ocean on the planet. It flew for hours more before disappearing entirely into the southern Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from where it was supposed to be. The world woke up to news that morning that made no sense. A modern commercial aircraft, equipped with cutting-edge navigation and communication systems, had gone missing. Not delayed, not diverted, missing. In the decades prior, aviation had reached a point where such a thing seemed nearly impossible. Planes are tracked continuously. They communicate constantly. They leave data trails. And yet here was a 200-ton jetliner, full of human beings, that had effectively ceased to exist. The confusion among officials was immediate and visible. The grief among families was devastating and public. And the questions, so many questions, had no answers. Search operations began almost immediately, drawing in resources from more than 24 nations. Ships crossed the South China Sea. Aircraft swept the Strait of Malacca. Satellites were repositioned and retasked. It was the most expensive and expansive search effort in the history of civil aviation, covering an area larger than many countries. And yet for months, then years, the ocean gave back almost nothing. The scale of the search was staggering, and the silence it returned was equally staggering. Officials refined their models, recalculated drift trajectories, consulted oceanographers and satellite engineers, and still the plane remained hidden. The southern Indian Ocean, already one of the least hospitable and least traveled bodies of water on Earth, seemed to swallow every effort whole. Then, in the summer of 2015, a single piece of the aircraft washed ashore on Réunion Island, a small French territory sitting in the western Indian Ocean. It was a flaperon, a hinged surface from the wing of a Boeing 777. Malaysian authorities confirmed the connection to MH370, and for the first time, the world had physical proof that the plane had, in fact, gone down somewhere in the Indian Ocean. More pieces would follow in the years after. Fragments of wing panels, interior components, engine cowling, washing up along coastlines as far apart as Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania, and South Africa. Each piece was analyzed, catalogued, and debated. Each one confirmed the loss without explaining it. The debris told investigators that the plane was gone, but the ocean floor still held every secret about how and why. For over a decade, that is where things stood. Confirmed loss with no confirmed explanation. A field of debris spread across thousands of miles of coastline, but no fuselage, no flight recorders, and no answers to the questions that mattered most. Then, in 2025, everything changed. Ocean Infinity, a marine exploration company based in the United States, launched what would become the most technologically advanced underwater search ever undertaken for missing aircraft. Previous searches had used sonar-equipped vessels and standard deep-sea equipment, but Ocean Infinity's 2025 mission brought something fundamentally different to the operation. Autonomous underwater vehicles, guided by artificial intelligence-assisted sonar mapping systems, were deployed across a newly calculated search zone that had been developed using years of refined satellite data, updated ocean current modeling, and the accumulated drift analysis from every piece of recovered debris. The new search area fell outside the original primary search zones, a region that had been technically accessible but never fully examined, sitting at depths that exceeded the height of Mount Everest. The vehicles descended into near-total darkness, operating independently for extended periods, scanning the seafloor with a precision that earlier technology simply could not have achieved. Week after week, they returned data showing deep trenches, volcanic ridges, silt fields, and underwater geography that had never been mapped in such detail. It was extraordinary science happening in service of an extraordinary tragedy. And then, after weeks of searching, one of the vehicles returned a sonar signature that stopped everyone in the operations room cold. The image showed a large metallic object resting on the ocean floor. Its shape was symmetrical in a way that natural formations are not. Its outline, even through the distortion of deep sonar, matched the profile of a wide-body commercial aircraft. Analysts stared at the data, ran it through verification models, compared it against every possible alternative explanation, and arrived at the conclusion that the world had been waiting over a decade to reach. They had found Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. What the subsequent footage revealed was something that no one, not the investigators, not the families, not the aviation analysts who had spent years theorizing about this aircraft, had fully prepared for. The wreck was not scattered. It was not the debris field that most experts had predicted, spread across miles of ocean floor from a high-speed impact. The aircraft was largely intact. It sat upright in the silt, its tail section partially buried, its wings broken but still recognizable, its fuselage holding its shape in the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. The Malaysia Airlines logo was still visible through a layer of sediment, ghostly and surreal beneath thousands of meters of water. Remote-operated submersibles were sent down with cameras, and the footage they transmitted back was haunting in a way that no simulation or reconstruction could have prepared anyone for. The cabin interior was still largely intact. Rows of seats remained bolted to the floor. Personal belongings, headphones, shoes, a stuffed animal, drifted slowly in the cold currents that moved through the broken sections of the hull. The images were both deeply human and deeply unsettling, a preserved snapshot of an ordinary flight frozen in an extraordinary moment of disaster. Investigators watching the live feeds described the experience as disorienting, the mundane details of commercial air travel suspended in one of the most remote and unreachable places on Earth. The cockpit footage was where the investigation took its darkest and most confounding turn. The door separating the cockpit from the cabin appeared sealed, and the evidence suggested it had been locked from the inside. Whether that represented an intentional act or the result of emergency pressure on the locking mechanism remains unclear, but the implication was impossible to ignore. Someone in that cockpit had engaged the lock. The door showed no signs of forced entry from the cabin side, raising immediate and serious questions about what had been happening in those final hours aboard the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, investigators found skeletal remains in the captain's seat. The remains were positioned with hands near the control yoke and an oxygen mask hanging close to the jaw. The co-pilot's seat was empty. That single detail, one seat occupied, one seat vacant, a locked door between the cockpit and the rest of the aircraft, sent an immediate shockwave through the investigation. It suggested that whoever was in the cockpit at the end was alone in that space, and that whatever the final sequence of events was, it involved deliberate action rather than passive incapacitation. The recovery of human remains presented its own disturbing dimension. Despite 239 people having been aboard, investigators found only a small number of sets of remains within the wreckage, far fewer than ocean conditions and the passage of time could reasonably account for. Marine scavengers, current dispersal, and decomposition over more than a decade could explain some of the discrepancy. But forensic experts acknowledged that the number was significantly lower than expected, even accounting for all of those factors, and that the distribution of what was found did not follow the patterns typical of aviation accident sites. These were details that no official statement fully explained, and they became some of the most discussed and contested elements of the discovery. The physical evidence inside the aircraft also pointed toward something violent and sudden occurring at altitude. Interior walls showed signs of outward warping consistent with rapid decompression. Seatbelts had been torn from their anchor points with a force that spoke to something catastrophic rather than a controlled descent. Tray tables had been displaced with enough energy to embed into surrounding surfaces. And yet the fuselage itself had remained largely intact, a contradiction that complicated every theory. The evidence of a violent decompression event sat alongside evidence of an aircraft that had, by most appearances, reached the ocean floor in a relatively controlled manner. Reconciling those two things was not straightforward. Then came the discovery that fundamentally altered the character of the investigation. The flight data recorder, the device that should have contained every piece of technical information about the aircraft's final hours of operation, had its outer casing recovered in reasonable condition. But the internal memory module, the component that actually stores the data, was gone. It had either been removed or destroyed in a way that was not consistent with impact damage. This was not a matter of ocean conditions degrading the equipment over time. The damage was targeted and deliberate in its nature. The cockpit voice recorder, which would have captured everything said and heard in the flight deck during the final hours, was missing entirely from where it should have been located. Behind a rear cabin panel, investigators found evidence of unauthorized modifications to the aircraft's electrical systems. Wiring harnesses had been cut, rerouted, and spliced in a manner that demonstrated detailed knowledge of the aircraft's internal architecture. This was not random damage. This was not the kind of disruption that results from impact or structural failure. The modifications had been made by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and exactly what systems they were targeting. The intention, investigators concluded, was to disable specific functions, and whoever carried out these modifications had done so with enough technical expertise to execute them precisely. Near this area of the aircraft, a handwritten note was recovered, severely damaged by water but partially legible. Authorities declined to release the full contents of the note, citing the ongoing forensic investigation. That decision, to withhold information about a document recovered from inside the wreck of an aircraft that had been missing for over a decade, predictably generated fury and suspicion. For the families of those aboard, who had already endured years of incomplete information and contradictory official statements, the concealment of any evidence felt like another wound. And it was not the only thing that had apparently been concealed. As details about the wreck emerged, so too did accounts from people inside the original investigation. Former analysts, contractors, and officials connected to the satellite tracking and search operations who came forward to describe information that had been classified, sidelined, or simply not shared across the multinational teams working the case. Satellite imagery captured in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, which showed debris patterns in the southern Indian Ocean, had reportedly been assessed and dismissed during the early search period. Whether that dismissal was a genuine analytical error or something more deliberate became a central point of contention. The families of those aboard MH370 have been waiting for more than a decade for answers, and the discovery of the wreck, rather than providing closure, reopened every wound while adding new ones. The confirmation that the aircraft had been found, that their loved one's final resting place was known, brought a grief that was somehow sharper than the ambiguity that had preceded it. And the details emerging from the wreckage, the locked cockpit, the missing data, the modified wiring, the withheld documents, made clear that whatever had happened aboard that flight, the full truth was still being guarded somewhere. Aviation analysts who had spent years studying every available piece of information about this case found themselves confronting evidence that did not fit neatly into any of the scenarios they had modeled. The aircraft's location was not where the highest probability search zones had indicated it should be. The condition of the wreck challenged assumptions about the final moments of the flight. The physical evidence inside pointed simultaneously toward catastrophic structural failure and toward deliberate human action. The absence of black box data, the removal of the memory module, the unauthorized wiring modifications, these were not the artifacts of an accident. They were the artifacts of intent. That is what makes the footage from the wreck of flight MH370 so deeply unsettling. It is not simply the imagery of a tragedy preserved in the deep ocean, though that alone is haunting enough. It is the realization that the evidence recovered from that aircraft floor does not close the mystery. It extends it. The plane has been found. The people aboard will never come home. And the answers to the most fundamental questions, who did this, how did they do it, and what were they trying to accomplish, remain as elusive as the aircraft itself was for 11 years. What we have now is footage, physical evidence, and a wreck site that will be studied for years to come. What we do not have is the complete truth. And for 239 families spread across dozens of countries, that absence is not abstract. It is personal, daily, and ongoing. The ocean gave up its greatest secret in 2025, but it did not give up all of them. The wreckage of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 sits at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, thousands of meters below the surface, in a darkness that most of the world will never see. And somewhere within what remains of that aircraft, the final chapter of this story is still waiting to be read.